It's more because I sat with a lot of therapy clients for years who were really struggling, whether it was with their own bad divorce, their own bad marriage, their parents' bad divorce. And I thought there has to be something that is better for people. And then when my youngest went to kindergarten, I got this flyer on collaborative divorce and I took a training. And then I became a mediator and have been doing this work for about 15 years now. And some of it has evolved. And so I'm going to talk about all those different roles today. Originally, I was going to show a quick little video clip from YouTube with a bunch of people saying the words, I want a divorce, in all the ways you can imagine that people would say that, with anger and sadness and confusion and hurt. Probably lots of movies you can imagine that you've seen that have this topic. And the reason that I was going to show that was because I want people to think about what really happens in a divorce. Um, in a divorce, right, people have to make really big decisions about their kids and their money. And divorce is the only time we ask people to make those kinds of decisions when they're grieving. Any other time someone's grieving, we say, take some time. Don't make any big changes right now, right? Just grieve and mourn and give yourself some time. And in divorce, we do the exact opposite. We ask people to make life life changing decisions about the things that keep them up at night while they're feeling sadness and anger and hurt and fear and all the other things that you can imagine. And so I just want people to be mindful of what goes on when people are making these decisions in divorce. All right, next slide. So today I'm going to talk about working with clients before, during, and after the divorce process, and all the different ways that that a mental health professional might be involved in this. I'm going to talk about an overview of the actual divorce process, just so people understand, like if you have a client going through divorce, what all the words are and what's happening for people. And then I'm going to talk about the different ages and stages of development for kids and how that intersects with divorce. As Michael said at the beginning, I'm a child and adolescent psychologist, and so that's one of the pieces that I really like doing in this work. And then throughout and at the end, I'm going to give some examples of what this looks like in actual practice. All right, next slide, please. So before divorce, there is this concept called discernment counseling. And it was developed by Bill Doherty in Minnesota in response to the tendency that once couples met with a lawyer or one person like sought out a divorce consultation, all of a sudden the train had left the station and a divorce was happening. And he thought there's got to be a way to slow this down. So discernment counseling is really for those clients. I don't know how many people here see couples, but like when you're working with a couple and maybe one person is sort of leaning out and thinking they want a divorce and one person very much wants to save the marriage, or they're just spinning on the same, rinse repeat of all the fights that they've had, but they're not making any progress. Or if someone has used the word divorce, like I think I want a divorce. I think discernment counseling is it's really designed for these couples on the brink. And what it is a very short term, 1 to 5 session model with a lot of structure. We say 1 to 5 sessions because it's voluntary. So if someone didn't like it, they could, of course, leave after one session. But most people spend 3, 4, 5 sessions in this. It looks very different than couples therapy because you're not working on issues. You're deciding, do you want to work on issues? And the idea is that any couple has 3 paths that they could follow. There's the status quo, and usually by the time people have made this kind of phone call, the status quo isn't acceptable, but it's of course an option. There is couples therapy, or there's divorce and separation. When we say couples therapy in this model, we're not saying it means you're going to stay married. The concept is, could you spend 6 months in couples therapy with an all out, kind of wholehearted effort to restore the marriage to health, and take the word divorce off the table, surrounding yourself with all the supports available? The structure of the appointment is that it's an hour and a half. And during that time, I work with each person individually and both of the people together. The idea is that you want people not just to point a finger at their partner, and anyone who has done couples therapy probably knows what I mean by that, where they say, if she just changed or if he just changed, this would all be better. But really to look inward at how they have contributed to the breakdown of the marriage and what they really want for the future of the marriage. And trying to get to that with some clarity and confidence, because no one makes a decision to divorce lightly. And this slows people down and has a process for some really good structured questions so that people can make those decisions. In my experience, it is really helpful for either of the paths of couples therapy or divorce, in that it slows things down and focuses people. I'm sure we've all had couples who are just in couples therapy, checking a box to say they said that they did couples therapy, and then they can feel good about it. But we all know that those couples therapy don't work, right? Both people have to be actively engaged and committed. And if a couple does end up taking the divorce route, my experience is that it sets them up for a better process, because people have had some really hard, difficult emotional conversations that prepare them for the divorce, instead of one person just sort of being handed papers or blindsided by it. And so, an example of what this looks like is, a couple years ago, I worked with a couple, and a colleague of mine referred them to me. They'd been in couples therapy with her for a while, and they were just spinning. And usually, we kind of think about who's the person who's leaning in and who's the person who's leaning out. So, the person who's leaning in is the one who wants to save the marriage, and the person who's leaning out wants to leave the marriage. In this case, actually, both of them really wanted the marriage to continue, but the husband was leaning out in the sense that he had said, if if her alcoholism doesn't change, if she won't address her alcoholism, I can't stay in this situation. And so we spent 4 sessions together, and the wife was really clear that that was not work she was willing or able to do. And so I think it was with heavy hearts, but he felt a lot of clarity in his decision to end the marriage. And that's what happened. And so sometimes it goes the other way, and people might choose to go back into couples therapy. So that is one way that we work with clients before a divorce. Next slide. If a divorce is happening, um, a divorce is obviously a legal process. And that legal process involves two key documents. One we call the marital settlement agreement, and that's all the money, the assets, the liabilities, the house, the retirement, all that stuff. The other is what we call the parental allocation judgment. And that's the document that tells a couple with clarity what they're going to be doing with their kids, right? They're coming to decisions about parenting time and about decision making. How a couple gets to those decisions for those two documents and how they navigate it are the different processes in place to get a divorce. Next slide, please. The three ways people can get divorced are sort of traditional litigation, and then the two methods of alternative dispute resolution, mediation and collaborative law. My bias, you're going to hear it throughout, is for mediation and collaborative law, and I'll get more into that. But I do want people to understand the whole landscape of the divorcing world. And I want to give a quick disclaimer. I'm a therapist, not a lawyer. And so while I know a lot of the things that happen, obviously I'm staying in my lane here. I work as a mental health professional, but I will kind of say what those people do in those roles. And all of my knowledge is based on working in Illinois, and divorce law is a state by state thing. Next slide. So litigation is kind of what people usually think of, I think, when they think of a divorce. Even though most of these cases, 90 to 95%, settle before they ever make it to a trial, this is the adversarial route of, of a divorce. And it is a positional way of getting divorced. What I mean by that is people state a position and then they sort of argue back and forth about that position. A position might be something like, I'm getting the house. A position might be, I want 50% of the parenting time. As an example, with 50% of the parenting time, right? Like you could say to someone, okay, so you get your kids from 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. Are we all set? And I think everybody would know and say, well, of course not. That's ridiculous. Like my kids would be asleep the whole time. And so when we get into the other methods, you'll see how we try to move people away from those positions and into more of needs and interests. But in a traditional model, it is adversarial. I look at it as sort of like a game of telephone. Party A talks to their lawyer talks to party B lawyer talks to party B, and then they go back and forth, hopefully cooperatively, often argumentatively, figuring out what are we doing with the money and the kids. If they cannot come to a decision, it will land in front of a judge. And what I have learned, even though I don't go into court, is that judges are just people and they have blind spots. And how your divorce gets resolved varies widely based on the judge you get. And so that is why I have a bias that we want people to be making these decisions, not someone else making these decisions for them. My other bias is that I think it is very hard to go from an adversarial court process to a positive co-parenting relationship. And so that's why, next slide, please, I am very biased on alternative dispute resolution. For both mediation and collaborative law, it requires that a family practice lawyer is specially trained in these areas. They're trained as a mediator, they're trained in collaborative divorce. If it is mediation, you might enter through your lawyer. If it's collaborative, you might enter the process through a financial neutral, a mental health professional, or a lawyer. And again, the location matters. During COVID, a lot of this work got switched to Zoom. So even though it's online, it is still a state by state process. And so your lawyer has to practice in the place where you're getting divorced. Next slide, please. So first, we're going to talk about mediation. Mediation is an interest-based process. So instead of that positional from the adversarial route, this is an interest-based negotiation. And what that means, oh, hello, is you start with goals and concerns, address.
Deanna, I think you muted yourself by mistake.
How long ago did I mute myself?
Like 2 syllables.
Okay. So mediation. Sorry about that. I'm not sure how that happened. All right. So with mediation, it's an interest-based negotiation. And you're starting with the goals and concerns, addressing what each party needs and what they're concerned about, hoping to get what we think of as like a win-win solution. It is a voluntary participation process, and mediation really requires that both people be able to advocate for themselves and participate in a discussion. The mediator will help structure and facilitate that discussion. They'll know the issues that need to get decided, but it will require that the people can advocate for themselves. Mental health professionals can be mediators, lawyers can be mediators. When I mediate, I only mediate parenting issues because I don't want to deal with people's money. But you can go to either type of mediator depending what people need. And occasionally there's a process called lawyer assisted mediation where the lawyers are actually in the room. But in either one, it really is the difference between this and collaborative divorce. One of the fundamental differences is um, how much a person can advocate for themselves, I think. At the end of the process of mediation, you leave with a memorandum of understanding, which gets drafted into those two documents, the parental allocation judgment and the marital settlement act. You only go to court with that document. So everything else is private. In contrast, in a litigated divorce, if people are entering orders into the court, those are all part of the court record. So sometimes people are very drawn to alternative dispute resolution because it's also a much more private process. Next slide, please.
Excuse
So
me, Deanna, would you prefer questions to be at the end, or do you want them as you go along?
um, I'm fine either way. Did someone have a question?
Yeah, so yeah, one question. Well, you can decide if you want to just at the end or not, but can you say something about the dynamics in couples who are in the 10% that end up in litigation?
Oh, I sure can. Sure. So, so in the group that takes the traditional route, and I don't actually know the breakdown of how many people pick litigation versus collaborative versus mediation, but within that group of litigated cases, only 5 to 10% will actually end up before a judge in a trial. Most of them will settle before they get to that. But the 5 to 10% that get to a trial are usually very high conflict. And that might be about the money, it might be about the kids, it might be about both. Some of the things that I often see are about parenting time. If someone swears up and down that they want 50% and the other person's like, absolutely not, these are the kinds of things that people will fight about. And if this is the hill they're going to die on and they can't settle it before a trial, then they ultimately end up in front of a judge. It's incredibly expensive because the lawyers are prepping for this for a long period of time, and it's costly, not just financially. It's costly emotionally and physically, also. I think. But usually the reason they end up there not being able to settle is because the conflict is so high and there's not enough flexibility to create a deal. So in collaborative law, back to this one, what I'll say is this is a team approach. So whereas mediation, people need to be able to sort of advocate for themselves. In collaborative law, there's a team approach, and that team includes two attorneys, and it can include a financial neutral, a coach, and a child specialist. Um, the financial neutral uh, the attorneys and those roles I'm going to talk a little bit about, but I'll mostly emphasize the roles that mental health professionals play in the process. Not every meeting in a collaborative divorce is a full team meeting because that is sort of expensive and hard to coordinate. But when that does happen, often the coach is the one kind of leading or directing the meeting. And I always like to say that the word collaborative does not mean that the clients are collaborative. They might be amicable at points, but it is a divorce, and there's always conflict. And really, what it's referring to is that the professionals know how to collaborate and create a tight container to help people move through the process in the healthiest way possible. And the clients, just like in mediation, the clients aren't in court throughout the process. It's just at the very end when they have their final documents. So it's also a very private process. Next slide, please. So, an attorney, this role probably makes sense to people. They can probably picture what an attorney does, but they listen to what matters to their clients. They actively represent the client's interests. They educate and counsel about the law and possible outcomes. So, like if people are getting very positional, they might say, in court, you would not get that, or you would. Um, they are working collaboratively with the other professionals, And what that looks like is person A's lawyer is not looking to take advantage of person B, and vice versa. They're all looking for the goals and concerns to be met and a win-win solution. And finally, they prepare the documents and enter them into court. Next slide. For the financial neutral role, that is a single neutral picked by both the parties in the divorce. And this person is usually, this role is used when there's something complicated about the finances. If it's a pretty vanilla financial case, people might not necessarily pick a financial neutral, but this is a really helpful role when there's anything complicated going on. This person gathers and organizes all the financial information. They develop budgets. They create a balance statement that has all the assets and liabilities, and then work with the team to think about the different ways that you could divide assets, right? Like, so even if people were going to divide the marital assets, like kind of 50-50, someone might want more cash, someone might want more retirement, someone might want the house, and they work to just lay out a bunch of different scenarios like that. And then I think one of the things that I think is really helpful about this role is that often in divorces, right, or in families, people specialize. And if one person has been the primary financial manager of the household, right, the other person can often either feel in the dark about their finances or less confident. And so the financial neutral can work with that party to increase their financial literacy so that post divorce they feel empowered and competent with their budget and their finances. Next slide. So now we're going to talk about the different roles that mental health professionals play. And these are both roles that I do, so I'm happy to answer questions about these too. A divorce coach is, there can be one coach or two coach in a case, two coaches in a case. I would say almost all the cases I work on are a one coach model, but I have done a handful of two coach models. The two coach model is really designed for if one person is going to have difficulty sharing a neutral professional. So picture someone who's really fragile or maybe has personality disorder, and then you might have two. But otherwise, you start to get a lot of cooks in the kitchen, and that can get complicated and expensive. So, what a coach does during the process is they first start by just helping clients understand their goals and concerns. Again, these are the touch point in collaborative divorce and mediation that when things get bumpy, we always go back to those goals to try to keep people on track. The goals can be about the process, about someone's future, about the kids, whatever is important to a client. And it's not a static document. You can always add new goals as they emerge throughout the process. The coach is also there to help manage strong emotions. Like back to the thing we started with, right? People are scared, they're angry, they're hurt, and they're trying to make good decisions. And no one makes their best decision from those places. And so a coach can help people who get dysregulated, help calm them down so that they can, get their full brain back online. And lawyers love this because they don't always want the crying clients, right? They like someone with expertise in dealing with that. Coaches also work to improve communication. This is not a time that you're working on the marital issues, that ship has sailed, but trying to improve communication so that people can co-parent effectively, right? Like we're going to send these people out into the world. We want them to be able to communicate. And then coaches intervene on problematic behaviors that might be between the two, like between the couple or within the team. And so what that looks like is I had a case where the husband would always sort of point his finger at the wife and say, "You know this," and the wife felt like she was in the principal's office, like she was in trouble, she was feeling belittled, and so we worked with the husband to say, like, this is not productive. And we worked with the wife to help her regulate herself when he did that. And that kept it on track. Problematic behaviors are not just between the divorcing couple, unfortunately. Sometimes they emerge on a team, right? It's human beings, loaded situations. And so the coach also can work with the team when they notice problematic behaviors. Like if a lawyer is doing something that triggers a client, we might say, can you soften your tone, or can you slow down your speech, or whatever we're noticing that might be getting the process off track. Next slide, please.
Question, Deanna, what kind of training is there involved for a coach?
I love this question. So, to be a collaborative divorce coach in Illinois, what you do is you take a basic training, and the next one, I can plug it, is in October in Oak Park. And somewhere in the slides, I do have the link to Collaborative Divorce Illinois. And you get trained as a mediator, which is a 40-hour training. Sometimes they're like a series of weekends, sometimes they're like a week-long class. There's different models, but those are the two things that you do. And then that's the training that goes into it. For a child specialist, which is the next role I'll talk about, there's some additional stuff because you also have to prove a competency in working with children. So even though I came in as a child and adolescent psychologist, I did extra training specific to children and divorce to meet that competency. Good question. Um, So for the coach role, I also like people to understand that the coach is not your therapist. It's a very different role. And for me, this is a really, I kind of like having this balance in my practice. My therapy work is with people that have been with me for a decade or more, right? And we do this long, slow, insight-oriented work. In this work, it's really directive and goal-oriented. We're trying to move someone through a divorce to get to the other side in the healthiest way possible. Um, while I might learn people's histories because it might be relevant to how they're coping, we're not processing their early childhood in this process, right? It's really about what do we need to do to keep people sort of healthy enough and focused to make good decisions. And then it's a time limited relationship, so it ends at the end of the divorce. And one other thing that I think coaches do really well is work on pacing on a team. So, back to the beginning, right? If we think about one person who wants the divorce and one person doesn't, which is not an uncommon dynamic, it's pretty frequent. Often, what happens, right, is one person has been thinking about getting a divorce for years, and they've mourned the loss of this marriage by the time they've actually asked for the divorce. And the other person's like, holy cow, what is happening here? And they are not at all in the same place. They're blindsided, they're flooded. And so the divorce will never move as fast as the person who asked for it, and it will never move as slow as the person who doesn't want it. And so there's a sort of a dance of helping people navigate that kind of pacing issue. Next slide. So the other role that a mental health professional can play is the child specialist role. And this is a single neutral selected by both. So like the financial neutral, there would only ever be one child specialist on a case. And to the earlier question, this is the one that requires some additional training to make sure that people are competent in children and how divorce affects children. The way I think of this role is that we really want to bring the child's voice into the divorce process without actually bringing the child into the process. I will say to people, we want to have children, not children of divorce. And the difference really is, right, when a child can just be doing their thing and not have to manage adult issues or dynamics, they can carry on with their development, right? And so that's one of the things that I think a child specialist can help with. I help parents understand how divorce impacts kids. It's something that we'll talk about in the second half of this presentation, but different ages and stages have very different experiences of divorce, and parents need to understand that to shepherd their kids through that. If needed, I help parents come up with a script to tell their kids about the divorce. And I teach parents skills to be better co parents. I like the work of Karen Bunnell, and I think I have a link to her later in this presentation. And she talks about a concept of parent mind versus spouse mind. Spouse mind, you can imagine, is stuck in the dysfunctional marital dynamic. And parent mind is when you are really putting your kids' needs front and center. And that is the place we want parents working from when they're making decisions about their kids. We don't want them mad about the reasons the divorce is happening. We want them to be thinking about their unique kids and their unique needs. Um, I One of the things that I do in this role is I actually work on the parental allocation judgment. So what that looks like is usually I work separately with the two parents to talk through all the things that go into the parenting allocation judgment. That includes parenting time during holidays, decision making in the four major categories that the court cares about, which are academic, extracurricular, religious, and medical. And it's not that people need to know, like, oh, my 3 year old is going to get braces when they're 12. It's more that you need to have a process should conflict arise and two people don't agree. Because when you're joint decision makers, you have to come to agreement in those major areas. And if you agree, then all is well and you just go about your business. But if there's a disagreement, there's a process in place that usually involves some facilitated conversation. Because what the court does not want is a bunch of people like in there trying to figure out their kids' soccer enrollment. And I use that as an example because that is one that I have worked on. A couple that went to court nonstop about soccer. This stuff happens. Um, then what I do is I take that information and a lawyer will draft it into the PAJ because it is a legal document and I'm not a legal professional. But all the decisions that go into it are much more geared, I think, to mental health practitioners who understand kids and development. It's also a role where people can bring clinical expertise to families who have special needs children. So picture something like certain diagnoses that kids might have and how they would be affected by divorce, right? A kid with ADHD is going to need help getting stuff between two places. A kid who's on the spectrum is going to have a harder time with transitions. And this is something that we can bring some expertise and creativity to help parents come up with some solutions. They're not rocket science, right? Like it might be a kid with ADHD has a little checklist so that they know what they need to pack between two homes so they're not stressed out. But those little things end up making a really big difference, helping parents understand to do transitions at the school to minimize transitions if transitions are hard for a kid. Um, this is the one role where you can work with the family beyond the divorce. And that's not uncommon. So, what might happen is if someone has like a 4 year old going through a divorce, and then a couple years later, the schedule that they had for their 4 year old is no longer appropriate, or someone's job changed and they want to think it through, they might come back for a session or two and we'll just kind of we'll create a new parenting plan for them. If they're fighting about it, they're going to need a lawyer in court. But if they are both in agreement that they want to change something, they don't actually have to go back to court and change the document. They can just work something out between themselves. Next slide, please. So this is the one where we have to skip a slide. Yeah. I'd like to give a little plug for how to be a helpful therapist to divorcing clients. These are things that either I have learned or seen as problematic and well-intentioned therapists, but in a problematic way. The first one is to remember your role. Sounds really obvious. You're not a lawyer. Don't give legal advice, right? But I cannot tell you how many lawyers will say to me, my client's therapist told them that they should get the house or they should get more parenting time. And now I have to undo those unrealistic expectations, right? And that's a really hard place for a lawyer to be. Everyone's divorce is different. So even if you or your sister or your whatever had a divorce where they got something, it doesn't mean that your client will get that. I also think it's important to remember the negativity bias. By the time people get a divorce, right, they are not making any generous interpretations about their spouse. They're never giving the benefit of the doubt. And you are only hearing that side of the story, and their spouse's therapist is only hearing that side of the story. So I'm very cautious to people not to make a lot of diagnoses of spouses, like you're divorcing a narcissist, because I think everyone going through a divorce on certain days could probably look like a narcissist because they are so stressed and overwhelmed. And it would be unfair to diagnose them based on just this worst time in their life. And then this is, I think, the one that I have learned over and over again and had to really work with clients on. There's no emotional justice in divorce. The court doesn't care if you never did pickups and drop-offs. The court doesn't care if you were a jerk. Sometimes there's some money involved if there was an affair, but the court doesn't care if you had an affair. There, none of these things that have an emotional component have any bearing in a legal proceeding. And so trying setting someone up to feel like a victim, like they should get more because they were the like sort of the better person and aggrieved party, ends up being a real disservice to them. So that's my little plug for how to be a good therapist to a divorcing client. All right, next slide, please. So so we've talked about before divorce, right? You have discernment counseling. During divorce, a mental health professional might be a divorce coach, they might be a child specialist. What happens to families after a divorce? Um, I'm sure it comes as no surprise to know that not all co parents work effectively. And so sometimes they need additional support, whether it's on lowering the conflict, on making decisions. And so when people need that kind of support, they can come for co parent coaching. This is a role I do, but I'll distinguish it from two other roles in a second that are a little more intensive. So when people come for co-parent coaching, it might be voluntary or it might be court ordered. And it's usually for one of two reasons. Either they need help with communication, they're too conflictual, they can't figure that piece out, or there's a specific decision they're having trouble making. Back to my soccer example, I had one family that would come in every soccer season. We would make the decisions about soccer, and then they would come back at the next soccer season because the court did not want to see them about soccer. Some families I might see couples I might see every 2 weeks because they're just high conflict and they need a place to talk about their kids in a more productive way. If the situation is so conflict ridden, then there are two other roles that come in. One is what we call a guardian ad litem, and that person is actually a lawyer for the child or children in a divorce or post divorce. And that's obviously a lawyer can be that. The other one that mental health professionals can be is what's called a parenting coordinator. Parenting coordination is a lot of the same things as co-parent coaching, but one, it has a specialized training, and two, usually it has a decision making function to it. So like if two parents can't decide, the parenting coordinator might be sort of the tiebreaker and make a decision about someone's kids. For myself, I've decided it's not a role I want to do because I don't want to make decisions about other people's kids. I just want to help them get to that decision point. But sometimes the conflict is so high or people are so entrenched in their positions that they just can't get there without someone kind of telling them what to do. Next slide. So now we're going to shift gears. We've talked about before, during, and after a divorce, how mental health.
Excuse me, so before you go into this part, could you speak to your overall experience about what might distinguish psychodynamically between couples who will sort of fall into the litigation route versus those who will try and go the sort of mediation, collaborative divorce route? Is there any sort of pattern that you've noticed, or?
So I don't know if I think about it as a pattern. I think about it as capacity for flexibility. Like if you are so rigid that you can only see one way of doing something and it's your way, it is going to be very hard to mediate or do something else, right? You're probably going to need someone to ultimately say this is what's going to happen. But I think when people have some capacity for flexibility and even if at times it goes away in the moment because of strong feelings, I think then they can be a candidate for mediation or collaborative divorce. Does that answer the question?
Mhm. Yeah, thanks.
So I want to shift gears and talk a little bit about kids and how they experience a divorce. Whether you're working with a parent going through a divorce or a child client, or understanding the principles, the developmental principles that are at play for kids, like guides how we think about the process. I know a lot of people in this room work with older teenagers and emerging adults, and so I'll go through the whole lifespan on how kids experience this because sometimes the divorce happened when they were younger and they might be stuck in something. And I think thinking through development really helps us understand what was going on for a kid when this happened or is happening. Next slide. And so these are the different, so we're going to cover this whole section from infants to college students and think about what does it look like to be going through this and what are the things that the adults need to be thinking about in terms of developmental principles that are at play. So next slide, we'll start with infants. Uh, I'm sure I don't have to say to this room full of people that attachment is the most important thing we think about when we think about infants, right? And it's going to be the thing that guides and shapes how decisions are made when kids are at this age and a divorce is happening. Um, Also, I like people to remember that infants are very tuned into parents' moods, right? They pick up on stress, they pick up on anger. And we want kids to be in calm spaces that are considering that attachment matters and support that. So what we don't want is lots of separations that might increase insecurity. Instead, we want lots of contact for both parents, but with a focus on the primary attachment and that being the place where the child sleeps at night. Um, but we want lots of contact from the second parent because we don't want something like stranger anxiety, which emerges, around 6 to 8 months. We don't want a kid to develop that in response to a parent that they're not seeing frequently enough. The way we think about this in a parenting plan is fewer overnights, but lots of contact in the first 2 years. And this is much, much easier if parents can live close together. Because then you can have frequent contact. Maybe the parent comes over, gives the bottle, or puts the baby to bed and then leaves, but the child is always falling asleep and waking up in the same home. We know that children will bond with lots of contact, and the relationship is not impaired at this age by having fewer overnights with the second parent. And I'm going to give an example of what this looks like, kind of boots on the ground. I worked with a family who had an 18-month-old girl, and she was co-sleeping with mom and breastfeeding. And dad had moved out. And mom was very motivated to wean the baby and end the co-sleeping because she was going to go back to work full time and needed a better sleep pattern. And dad really wanted more contact, and they hadn't quite figured out how to do this. So what we did was we first increased dad's periods of time with his daughter, so longer stretches of time during the day, both in mom's house and in his house. And then we started napping at dad's house. And then we moved to an overnight. So instead of it being sort of thrown into the deep end, it's a lot of little steps to get to the overnight with an infant so that it's not a stressful situation and it doesn't disrupt attachment. Next slide. So then we can think about toddlers. Um, when I think about like little kids, one of the things I try to remember is that at least 20% of divorces occur within the first 5 years of marriage. So if they have kids, they're often likely to be small kids, right? This is not an uncommon time to see a divorce. And while toddlers have a little more language, they certainly do not understand the concept of time and two houses and when they're going to be in different places. And so mostly we're trying to just use really simple language with little kids, like after one more sleep, you're going to see mommy, or maybe a color coded calendar for kids who are closer to 3 years old. Um, I'm hoping there are Winnicott fans in this group here today who understand the value of a transitional object. I work really hard to help parents understand that it is not just a stuffed animal and it's really important and it cannot be a pawn in a divorce. So if a child forgets it or a parent forgets it, you work really hard to make sure that transitional object makes it to the next house because you want it to go with the child so that it can be a soothing and comforting thing for them. As with all kids, we want consistency, right? Some parents get a little more strict or a little more lax during a divorce. And so we want them to understand that being consistent is really helpful for kids. I also help coach parents to understand that we do expect some regressive behaviors in kids as changes are made to their schedule. Um, a kid might, their toilet training might get disrupted, or they might wake up more at night. And that's pretty typical and not a concern unless it goes on for a long time. Next slide. Then we have our preschoolers. They have more complicated emotions that start to emerge, but they do not have the ability to fully understand or express these feelings. Anyone who's been around a preschooler knows this. One of the things that starts to emerge at this age is that there can be a fear of abandonment for kids, and they can worry about losing their parents. So, this is where a really predictable schedule can be soothing for kids at this age. And just like with all kids, we want patience and consistency. Next slide. Then we have our early, like young school age kids. These kids are so much more sophisticated than their younger siblings, but they need lots of help to understand a divorce and to adjust to these changes. At this age, one of the things they might feel is that their world is out of control, and we want to help them sort of gain a sense of control in areas where they can have input. And I'm really clear about this, that kids can have um, input but not decision making ability, and that we ask them for input on things that are age appropriate, like, do you want to help pick out some things to decorate your room? Not which parent do you want to live with? Because we never want to bring kids out of the child world into the adult world, because that disrupts their development, right? And so we wouldn't want to give them choices that are for adults only to make. We want to give them choices on things that are more age appropriate. This is an age where there can be a huge focus. This age and the next group kind of overlap on this one, a huge focus on justice, fairness, and rules. Anybody who's ever played a board game with a 8, 9, 10-year-old knows this. They're very rigid about rules. But what that looks like in a divorce is they're often looking to see who caused this, who's the right person and the wrong person in this, or the good person and the bad person, right? And and they want to get to the bottom of it. And I always give this example when it comes up because I have a colleague who got divorced when her daughter was about 9 years old. And this kid was so focused on getting to the bottom of it. She asked, not just at age 9, but again and again and again throughout adolescence even, why did you really get a divorce? You can just tell me what really happened here. And they stuck to the script, right? Fast forward, she goes to college, she dates a boy, and his parents decide when he's a freshman that they're getting a divorce. His parents, however, call him nonstop, use him as a confidant, air all the dirty laundry of the marriage. And the girl called her mom and said, I just want to thank you for never telling me. And I like to tell parents that because these kids will really push to get to the bottom of it. But you can't unsay something. And once they've heard it, they can't unhear it. And while it might be satisfying to be sort of the one in the right, it really is detrimental to kids' development to get all that adult information. This age group also is very can have a lot of grief about losing family stability, and so we want to be mindful that they might be grieving the loss of the family structure as they know it. Next slide, please. This is the preteens, our tweens, right? There's some overlap with that previous group, right? They're rigid moral views. They're looking for the truth. They have black and white thinking, right? They haven't gotten into abstract thinking. And so again, we want to help kids understand give honest but age appropriate answers to their questions. Sometimes parents will say, like, I just want to be honest. And I'm like, that's fine. But you also have to use the lens of age appropriate. And that's where we rule out most adult information. Um, and we say something more to the effect of, we had grown up problems that we couldn't fix, instead of all the dirty laundry that you might want to air. This is an age, as you can imagine, where kids are increasingly concerned with their friends' perceptions. They might be embarrassed by a divorce. And it's a place where, if you can give them some choice and control, again, that can be really helpful. What that might look like is, do you want to tell your friends about the divorce, or do you want me to tell their parents? At this age, they are worried that their parents might cause a scene at the baseball game or at an event. I worked with one family where the girl was getting a bat mitzvah, and she was really worried her parents would cause a scene. And so we talked about table arrangements and exit strategies and supportive people for each parent. And again, this isn't something that the court cares about, right? Like, this is, but it's something that families care deeply about. Like, if there's a milestone happening in the midst of a divorce, you want it to go well. And that bat mitzvah did go well. This is also an age where kids can be starting to be at risk for some risky behavior. At these ages, I think more about things like cutting and eating issues, but we want to make sure that parents have age appropriate structure and supervision. We don't want something to fall through the cracks because there are two households. Next slide, please. Then we get into teenagers. And now this is a wide range, right? There's a difference between early teens and older teens, but we're going to kind of lump them together here. Teenagers, as you know, are really busy forming their identity and separating from their parents. Um, Early teens can sometimes feel betrayed by a divorce. Also, developmentally, right, they're going through puberty. So there's just a whole nother layer added into the what this looks like for those kids. Older teens, once you get into like 17 or a high school or 18-year-old, where they're still captured under a parental allocation judgment, that is sort of the one time when you might start asking them some input about a parenting plan, parenting time structure, because you cannot strap a 17-year-old in a car seat and drop them off somewhere. I think the most important thing to think about with teenagers is that we still want them to be teenagers. There is a lot going on in adolescent development that's really important, and we don't want that to be shortchanged because there's a divorce going on in a family. We don't want adult tasks put on kids. What that often looks like for girls is that they might get parentified with increased caretaking responsibilities or becoming a confidant. Or boys might get parentified by being sort of the man of the house, right? And those things take them out of their adolescent world and put them in the adult world. But what we want is kids to be with their friends and figuring out who they are. Because it is such a peer focused time, we try to coach parents to think about being creative with their parenting time, like maybe the friends are allowed to come with you somewhere, but also to remind them that it's important for them to go out with their friends and not always insist that parenting time be family time. Even more so at this age, right? This group, particularly, I'm sure, knows about all the risky behaviors that can happen, whether that's substances or sex or self injury. And so good co-parent communication, again, is really important, right? If two people aren't talking to each other, they can be played against each other really easily, and we don't want those risky behaviors to take hold. Next slide. Then we have our college students. Now, these kids are technically outside the purview of a parenting allocation judgment, but they still really are kids and they experience a divorce. And because the graying of divorce is a term, maybe you've heard it, but what it means is more people are getting divorced later in life. It's not uncommon for someone to say, yeah, like our kids are out of the house and we're getting a divorce. They've actually termed it the freshman call because so many kids get a call their first semester of freshman year saying, hey, by the way, we're getting a divorce. I highly recommend to parents not to do that. Um, that you want to have that conversation in person and you want to do it on a break and not a holiday. You don't want it paired with a special holiday. Uh, Parents often think once my kids are in college, it doesn't matter anymore. I can do this and it won't affect them. But it's actually a time when kids have a very strong reaction to divorce. They might have feelings of guilt, like if I could have done something different to save the marriage, right? Like I was holding them together somehow. For these kids, they are leaving home for the first time, presumably, right? And all of a sudden, the concept of home is lost. Where will I come home to? And again, this is an area that the court doesn't really cover, but it matters to kids and families. And so, helping parents understand like, while you can't dictate your child's parenting time schedule anymore, they're an adult, you can provide some guidance to decrease their stress and say something like, we had some thoughts about the holidays. We want to make sure you see both of us and you still see grandma and grandpa and all your cousins. And again, even though it's not going to be in a legal document, these things matter to families. The other thing we often see in college students is some shock and cynicism. They might have romanticized their parents' relationship and how they grew up, so they can feel blindsided or confused by this. Like, if I thought my parents were fine, what else don't I know? And sometimes it can lead them to have some cynicism in their own romantic relationships. And then again, this is an age where even though they are legally adults, they are still children and should not be confided in. Even like 40-year-olds don't want to know why their parents are really getting a divorce, is what I have found in my practice. But these ages, like sometimes I think parents are more likely to use them as confidants, and we want to guard against that. Next slide, please. So, two other issues, siblings and step families, I'm going to cover really briefly. Siblings, usually we think about as moving in a pack, and that's protective of kids. But occasionally, and usually it's also logistically the easiest thing, they all move together and have the same schedule. But occasionally there are times to think about that you might want to do something different and alter a schedule to give some children some individual time. Or also, if kids are in a really wide age gap, like a teenager and a toddler, the schedule just wouldn't probably work to have them on the same thing. Often teenagers might be in a week to week, like a week on, a week off with parents. And a toddler, we would never want to put in a week on, week off schedule. But a teenager would not want to be transitioning every couple days or, living at one home with some, occasional contact with the other parent. So that's something to think about with siblings. Next slide. So this is a pretty big concept, sort of dating, step families, and divorce. So I'm just going to do sort of a brief overview of some things to think about. And I've listed in here, which I think is going to get shared, um, the link to Karen Bonnell's website because she has a great book called The Step Family Handbook. Most many people who get divorced ultimately end up dating again, right? And we can kind of predict that someone is going to start dating again, or both people are. And there's a lot of things to think about with this. When I'm writing a parenting plan with people, I always cover this topic. Not because it's enforceable, it's usually not very legally enforceable, but because it is a hot button issue it's like a landmine waiting to happen. And if you can have a proactive conversation with people about future significant others, it can be very, very protective to level set expectations. Um, if you think about it, right, like the kids should not have a revolving door of casual dating partners. I think most people kind of intuitively know that. But there's a concept sort of stable and enduring that you would not bring a significant other into your child's life unless it is a stable relationship and one that is going to be continuing on. It doesn't mean you're cohabitating, it doesn't mean you're going to get remarried, but that it's a really significant and stable relationship. And when I talk with people about it, we can think about the introduction and then what happens after that. Because we don't want the floodgates to open all of a sudden, like now that you've met Susie, she's going to be with us all the time. Really, you want it to develop organically and over time and in sort of a reasonable step up, right? And so while there's an introduction, and then maybe occasionally you see them, but often you don't because you don't want all your parenting time to be with the significant other. But there's things down the road. Can they attend the soccer game or the school, winter performance? Can they have a sleepover? Can they go on vacation with the kids? And because we don't want people to be blindsided by these things, we want them to have talked about how they want to handle that moving forward. Sometimes to help parents also understand what it's like for kids. Um, the example given sometimes is something to the effect of, if your 5-year old met Bobby at the park and was like, Mom, you're going to love Bobby. He's the best. We're going to move in with Bobby and you're going to love Bobby's parents and we're going to live with him forever now. You'd be like, no, no, we're not doing that. But that is what it sometimes feels like to kids who all of a sudden this person comes in and they're there all the time and they might have kids. And that's a lot to take in. So we want these things to move slowly and we want to watch kids' reactions to them. Um, okay, next slide. So within all of this stuff, we know that there are some overarching protective factors for kids in a divorce. We want to minimize conflict. We want to avoid loyalty binds. What that term means is that the kids don't have to choose between one parent or the other. They don't feel caught in the middle. If they finish their baseball game, they don't stand there paralyzed thinking, if I don't go to mom or dad first, they're going to be mad at me or they're going to be hurt, right? They don't even think about that stuff. And we want kids to have a good relationship with both parents because that is very protective for kids. Those are some of the principles we try to bring to this work. And I want to give a couple little examples of what this looks like in practice, and then I'll answer more questions, hopefully. So, like the bat mitzvah example, I was working on a case, but it was a wedding, and all the kids in the family were 25 or older. These are not kids who have a parenting allocation judgment. These are not kids who the court pays any attention to because they're legal adults. But the divorce was going on at the same time as the youngest child's wedding. And she was very worried, understandably, that that it would sort of take over her wedding. And so the parents and I talked about, like, how are we gonna protect the wedding weekend so that it's just about your daughter? And so the first thing they had me do was actually talk to their daughter. And their daughter sat down with me for an hour and she just told me the things she wanted to have happen and the things she didn't want to have to worry about. She wanted to make sure that they weren't talking about the divorce at the wedding. She wanted to make sure that everyone would get in a family photo and not be weird about it. She wanted some input on how to do a seating arrangement so that it wouldn't be tense. And so then I went back to the parents and we thought about things like, where are people going to sit? How are the two of you going to navigate your shared couple friends who are all going to be at this wedding and don't want to be in the middle of this and want to be supportive of both of you? And how do we make sure that nobody's talking about the divorce when what we should be talking about is the wedding? So that's an example where, again, that's not rocket science to have these conversations, right? But it's really important to families, and it makes a big difference. And you don't want someone's major milestone event, their graduation, their wedding, to be overshadowed by a divorce. So that's a place where I think mental health professionals have a lot of room to positively impact a divorce. Another case that I want to show is really different, but I think shows how our clinical expertise is priceless in these cases. I'm currently working on a case where the dad is schizophrenic. So it's a serious mental illness, right? And there's a lot of potential safety issues that need to be thought about. And yet, great dad. And when he's stable, he's a great parent and needs to have a good relationship with his kids, and his kids deserve that. So, luckily, in this space, we were able to use a lot of creativity to come up with some safety nets to put in place. It involved kind of a safety plan feedback loop where um, the mom was allowed to call the dad's therapist if she saw concerning behaviors, and the therapist was allowed to call the mom if dad stopped with his treatment protocol. Within that, there was still a lot of protections in place for dad's privacy so that his treatment was private, right? Confidentiality is a huge thing, and we want to maintain that privacy. But there needed to be some assurances that when dad was having parenting time, he was not in a psychotic episode. And then there was some processes in place for evaluating if something was concerning, to pause the parenting time, to stabilize him, and then to step him back up and get him right back into the parenting so that it wasn't like a punitive experience, but more like just a safety net. And so, again, like I think that is an area where if it goes to court, it can end up in a pretty messy place. But if two people are really willing to work with some creativity and some compassion, I think that a therapist can bring a lot of really good skills to that kind of situation. Okay, so that's a lot of information. We've covered how to help people before, during, and after a divorce, all the different ways people can get divorced, the ways that mental health practitioners can be involved in a divorce, and kids in divorce. And so now I know we've had a couple questions, but I want to open it up for additional questions.
So feel free to either send the questions via the chat or go ahead and ask them out loud.
Don't be shy. It looks like someone's asking a question, but they might be muted.
Yeah.
So I'm I'm absolutely amazed as to how well thought out that type of support system that as professionals we're offering, how much social work or has expanded, counseling has expanded to include, these directly these incidents of life in a way that can be so positive and helpful. Um, is this something that insurance pays, or is this something that's private pay?
This is private paid. So the way, so in my private practice with therapy clients, I do take insurance, but on the divorce side, I do not because there's no medical necessity, and so there wouldn't be a justification to an insurance company. Um, and just to be sort of forthcoming, it pays better than therapy does. Because you're in a realm, I charge less than a lawyer, but I charge more than I do for therapy for this work.
Well, it's completely understandable. I think it is best to just be straightforward too. you know, that this is what works for you as, a professional.
Yeah, and I will say, as someone who's blended these two pieces of my career, I really like the variety. I started a private practice when my kids were really little, and I wanted to grow it as I was ready to work more. But I did not just want to double my caseload, and I wanted to do something a little bit different. And so I have my slow and patient clients, and then I have my very directive work that is short term and episodic. And that's sort of a nice, for me, it's been a nice balance. And for
Mm.
anybody who's interested in this work, I highly recommend it. It's growing pretty rapidly. I think when I started it, it's I started when my youngest was in kindergarten. She's in college now, so I've been doing it about 15 years. And when I started, it took a while to kind of build it up. It's slow to get going, and you have to network and you have to get to know people. Now it's really busy and there's a lot of work. And I also think increasingly people understand that there are different ways to get divorced and that you can have a different outcome than the War of the Roses or whatever. And so I think more people are seeking this out. As more lawyers get trained, they know to educate clients. As more therapists hear about it, they know to send people for this kind of stuff. And whatever people might say or lawyer jokes people might make, I know amazing lawyers in this field who do really, really good family-centered work. And so it's just a great resource for people going through this really difficult time in their lives.
Sure, sure it is. It's so interesting. I used to do crisis work, and it's kind of that same thing, except your work goes on for how long? Or is it an hour here or a couple hours there?
So that's another way that it looks really different than therapy, right? It might be front loaded where I might see a couple for many hours within 1 week. I might not see them for 4 weeks or 6 weeks again, or I might see them regularly every week to try to make progress on things. It kind of depends what people are working on. And often they're trying to tackle parenting stuff before money. Uh, there's this idea that like you're separating the kids and the money. Really, it's all comes together, right? There's child support. There's different calculations for how much people owe depending on how many overnights they have. But
Mhm.
in theory, we're trying to separate that out a little bit. And so often I'm working with people really heavily on the parenting at the beginning of a case. And then I might just be sort of sporadically involved in it as they're really deep in the finances.
I like the idea that it's brief, basically, right? You had mentioned that. So the stress level, do you feel that it's not as much?
So I think that depends on who I'm working with because I have worked with couples where we might write a whole parenting plan, a parenting allocation judgment, like the whole thing in like 5 hours. And they're great and they're easy and they're cooperative and they're on the same page. And you can just tell they're not meant to be married, but they're really good co-parents. And then some people could spend 6 months figuring out how they're going to divide Christmas. And so different people are in the process for different lengths of time. So I never predict for people how long a divorce will take or how much it will cost. We usually say a divorce is as expensive as there are two factors: the number of decisions you have to make and the personalities of the people making them. And so I'm sure as therapists, you can all imagine that, that varies widely.
Yes, it does. So from week to week, you have such a different rhythm to what you do.
Yeah, I really do. I think it's one of the things that's sort of interesting. I have my anchored, weekly therapy clients that I see. And then I have just big blocks of time. And some weeks I might be crazy busy, and some weeks I might have a lighter week, and it's really nice. It does allow for a little more of my ability to schedule things and block off periods of time, whereas sort of my regular therapy clients tend to have a time that they come in, and that's pretty consistent week to week.
So what do you call yourself? How would you characterize what you do as far as, a title of sorts?
My business card
That's
is
the
a little
answer.
clouded. Usually, I think of myself as a clinical psychologist for the therapy side of my practice and a divorce coach because that sort of captures all of it. But I do put on all the different hats. It just doesn't all fit on a business card.
But the thing about the coaching, your education is in coaching.
No, I'm a clinical psychologist, and then I took additional training to become a coach.
Or so at some point you did though that that coaching. So
Yeah,
you can call yourself the
yes. And it's a very different skill set, right? I mean, for anybody who has done any aspect of coaching, it's a much more directive process. And the lawyers who do this work also get trained up because it's a very different, just a very different paradigm to approach couples with, right? We're not fighting this out. We're collectively solving this, hopefully to get everybody the best outcome possible.
oh it's
What would you say is the this probably not an easy to answer question, maybe it isn't fair. Um, what would you say is the most difficult part of this whole process for you in general?
So I think probably it's probably countertransferential reactions to difficult clients, right? If I got into this work because I loved working with kids and adolescents. I hated working at nights and on weekends. And so I don't actually see kids in my therapy practice anymore. But I think of this work as incredibly protective of kids, right? Like any difference we can make during this process is going to have a positive ripple effect down the road. And so that feels really personally like meaningful to me and lines up with my values. So I tend to have a very hard time and have to really kind of center myself and check myself when I see parents who are so angry and hurt that they are losing sight of their child and just really, really battling things out in a way that I can tell is really unhealthy for a kid. So I think for me, that's the hardest thing. And that the crises always arise on a Friday afternoon and right before a holiday.
Yeah.
I don't think I've had a Christmas break where I haven't had at least one emergency come up sometime before taking some time off.
yours.
Did you have a question, Abigail?
Oh, well, it's funny, she answered it in a way I was just going to comment on it. It's almost like a public health service that you're doing because to anything you can do to protect kids or to help them have a better outcome. I mean, you can imagine what a difference this could make for kids to have a less traumatic, even maybe even a growth experience in some ways sometimes. And I was going to comment too about just so if you can prevent, it's sort of damage control in a way.
Yes, it's like harm reduction, right?
Harm
It's not
reduction.
gay, but it's harm reduction.
I guess, and then I was gonna comment on like this issue of like how I guess I was gonna comment on the issue of how often you see that where parents really can't nobody wants to harm their kids, but like when they really can't put it aside. But you sort of answered that. But I guess another question is, I am curious, how often do you see families where they really were a complete mess, it was so contentious. How often do you see this process making it where they can couples can almost be friends, I
Yeah,
guess.
I will say, like, I hold on to a couple of those that are really like feel pretty miraculous to me. Sometimes I use a football metaphor, and my metaphor falls apart pretty quickly because I don't know enough about football to carry it on.
Mhm.
But I think about like kind of moving the ball down the field, right? Like these may not all be touchdown cases. Like you're not going to get the happy ending, and both of them are, dad and stepfather are walking the girl down the aisle or something. Like that's not usually particularly for the higher conflict ones. But I have seen some where I worked on a case a few years ago, and the wife was so angry that finally her lawyer fired her. Her lawyer could not got yelled at so many times she just could not take it anymore. And so you
Mhm.
can picture what they were like in, trying to make parenting decisions, and they're pretty mean to each other. And it was a family I did work with a little bit afterwards in that role that kind of continues on post divorce. And it took a while, but the dust settled, some healing happened, and it was probably 6 or 8 months later, and the dad had done something that was like, it wasn't great. Like he'd sort of lost it with the kids. And he felt really bad about it and he apologized to the kids. But he called his ex-wife and he just had such shame about it. And I think he was sort of confessing so he didn't get in trouble later down the road. And she said, "You just have to forgive yourself. It's really hard to parent. And I've been there."
Mm.
And I could have fallen over when they reported this back to me because
Right, the
not where
empathy.
that was headed. A year ago, that's not the tone they were taking. It was much more, gotcha, or covering your butt so you don't get in trouble with your co-parent. And to get to that place where there could be some vulnerability, right? So for anyone who has parented, you know that parenting is really hard and we all make mistakes and we're just trying to be the good enough parent, right? And but when divorced, if people are kind of using that against you, I should have more time because you forgot little Johnny at basketball pickup or whatever, right? Like that becomes a very difficult place to parent because it's full of mistakes. And if you can get people to a place that is slightly more compassionate, I think that only benefits children.
For sure.
Yeah.
And just lastly, it does feel like just for parents to know that there is somebody, especially when it's mo at its most contentious, that there's a route, an avenue that somebody they can talk to, like you said, that would be a safe place to sort of discuss some of this, or just a little support in the way they communicate with each other, or not a go-between, but so it sounds like that is something you will stay on board for a while to maybe help them just so they know that there's a way to get things resolved that doesn't have to be completely contentious. Is that right?
Yeah, it's really helpful as sort of like training wheels. I kind of think of myself as always trying to work myself out of a job, but I might be really supportive at the beginning. And sometimes even I'll tell people, I try not to do this for too long because it can drive you crazy, but I'll say, just include me on the communications for a while and I will jump in if I need to. But people tend to then have a better tone when I'm on it, and I'm not reading them all. I'm just, unless something pops up. And then over time, that's not needed anymore. They've kind of learned I need to communicate like this is my coworker, not like the person I hated when I was married to.
Okay. Interesting.
To, to what degree do you um, consult with or collaborate with any of your parents' therapists?
Definitely, particularly when I'm working in a child specialist role, if the children have a therapist, I definitely want to talk to that person because I find that a way to bring a kid's voice into the process without dragging them in. If I am working as a coach and one or both of them is in therapy, and I think it would be helpful either for the therapist to hear something or for me to hear something from the therapist, then I will work with that person to do that. So usually it's on the harder cases. If people are doing well and therapy is well set up as a support and a place for them, it's kind of like siloed. But when people are really struggling, it can be helpful to get a therapist on board. And sometimes I'll refer people to therapy if they're not in therapy.
Deanna, I have found this just fascinating and so helpful. And I've thought of so many times when I've heard from other clinicians asking for something like the service that you're doing. And so I know a lot of the folks in our audience probably are having those same thoughts. And I want to remind everyone that this will be posted on our website. So if you want to refer someone to, experience this as we did and listen to these words of wisdom, I just think this is going to be so helpful to so many people.
Thank you. And I will say, I'm always happy to help people find good divorce lawyers so that they don't end up in the wrong track because they don't know better.
Right. Have you written a book or have you started a book on this?
No, I can't imagine doing that, but thank you. That's very flattering.
Where should somebody start if you have a patient who is like thinking even about, I don't know, where should somebody start with like even figuring out, should it be mediation? Should it be this? Like where should somebody even start?
So often, what I have become to my neighbors, my colleagues, is sort of a person that you can bounce this off of. And what
Uh-huh.
is like, if someone knows they're getting a divorce, right? Often the starting point is a divorce lawyer. But knowing that there are different processes matters because you want to look for a lawyer who is trained in these things, right? If you go to a person who only litigates, the hammer is the only tool in the box.
Uh-huh.
Collaborative Divorce Illinois has a listing of all the collaboratively trained lawyers and like county by county. Um, Certainly people reach out to me sometimes if they're working with a couple or something, whether it's discernment or like they're headed to a divorce, can you just talk with them for a couple minutes and give them an overview? And I have it down to like an elevator pitch for people, just like a 10-minute conversation to steer people in a healthier direction.
Mhm.
And there's also a resource in Evanston called the Lilac Tree.
Oh, right. Yep.
If people have heard of that, it's a great resource for women. They run something, I don't know if they've changed the name, but it used to be called Divorce University. And it would be like this all-day event where people could kind of like quietly sneak out of their home and go and learn about divorce. And like all these things would be presented to people in
Mhm.
space too.
Okay. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Deanna. This was really informative, and your presentation was really um, organized to help us understand the process. I really appreciated it.
Thank you. It was really nice to talk with everybody. And I'm glad that people can know about all these things available.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for being with us again.
Have a good
Thank
night.
you.
Good night.
Thanks,
Take care.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.